We ask if this is Independence Day or Dependence Day. It's as we celebrate again this week of the birthday of our nation, it occurs to us that our holiday could at least in its subtitle be called Dependence Day. Back in July 4th, 1776, it's kind of interesting, Thomas Jefferson had included a paragraph on the freedom of slavery. And this nation that was supposed to be founded was not supposed to be a slave-holding country. And that paragraph is deleted. The other men that were part of the Independence Declaration declared that they didn't figure that timing was right for that. But he himself freed his 600 plus slaves as an example to the rest of those of Virginia to say this is the way it ought to be rather than this is the way it is. And that was really some of the story behind the story of our foundation of our country. It's interesting, the Bible text we're choosing is Psalm 33 verse 12 that said, "Blessed is the nation whose God is the Lord, the people he chose for his inheritance." Now, there's only two defining forces that have ever offered to die for you. Jesus Christ is one and the American soldier. One died for your soul, and the other died for your freedom. This is one of the things come up on the internet. I'd never seen this one before, but this is a Statue of Liberty with an attitude. It's kind of different than the Statue of Liberty we're used to, because the Statue of Liberty we're used to says, "Give me your tired, your weak, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The wretched refuse of your teeming shore, send these, the homeless, the tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the oak golden door." Emma Lazarus wrote this particular, and I remember we had to memorize that back in English class. If you remember back in high school, how many had to memorize that in English class? Okay, see, in the old days, they taught us good. In the new days, I guess they don't know what all that's about. So this is one Statue of Liberty that says, don't send your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, but into defense of the country. But it's interesting when we consider, first of all, in the founding of our fathers, the founding of our nation, that the early leaders that signed this Declaration of Independence that says we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty. It doesn't say happiness, it says the pursuit of happiness. And if we track down some of the story behind the story, we have one man that comes up that is a man by the name of Patrick Henry, that was in this period of time, that was one who said, "Give me liberty or give me death." And the next generation came along that says, "Give me liberty." And then the next generation came along and says, "Give me, give me, give me." And that's how things have changed from the way it was to the way it is today. Now, it's interesting to say, too, that in the course of human events, we have a Supreme Court that comes on the scene and decides to declare for American law to set aside the Constitution and put in place world law, world government, world law. And this is the transition that's happening, that world law is now trumping American Constitution. Do we like it? No, but is it happening? It just happened here in the last few weeks. But there's one thing we need to smile about, and that is, one of these days, Judge Jesus is going to be sitting at his desk, and he's going to say, "Well, I want you to put your right hand on my best-selling book, of whom I am the author, and I want you to, say after me, I solemnly swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth." And Judge Jesus is going to be sitting on the throne of heaven, and each and every, the Bible says, every knee shall bow, every tongue shall confess that Jesus is Lord. And it's interesting, you know why a judge wears black? You know why they're called Your Honor? You know why whenever they come into the room, it says, "All rise"? Because the Bible says that they are a minister of God. They are God's law. They represent God in the black robe, and in their walking into the courtroom, and when they swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth upon the Bible. This is all part of a God-honoring situation that our law was built on. They said, well, was our law built on English law or law before that? Well, English law is built on Moses' law, and Moses' law of the Ten Commandments. It was kind of interesting. I seen on the internet the other day that says all laws passed shouldn't be any longer than 10 pages long. I remember President Reagan got a bunch of laws, and the thing was about this thick, and he held it up and he says, you know, you can't even wade through that in 7 days, let alone 7 months, let alone 7 years. And he kind of tossed it aside. He says, and I'm supposed to sign this thing. But those are the things that are happening in the country. But let's realize after the dust settles, the Judge Jesus is still going to be judging. Now the 12 apostles paid dearly for the freedom of the gospel they preached, and they preached this gospel around the world. It's interesting that as Jesus washed the feet of the disciples, he says in Matthew 20:22, but Jesus answered said, you know not what you ask, because one wanted to sit in the right, one wanted to sit in the left. One of the mothers decided to curry favor with two of the apostles, that her sons, James and John, could sit on either side of Jesus on his throne. And, Lord, would you let my son sit at your right and at my left? Now, know ye not what you ask? You are able to drink of the cup that I shall drink of, and to be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized with. They said, oh, yeah, we're able. They didn't know what they said when they said, yeah, Lord, we are able. And Jesus says, and he said to them, you shall drink indeed of my cup of suffering, and be baptized with the baptism that I am baptized, a baptism of blood. But to sit on my right hand and on my left hand is not mine to give, but it shall be given to them for whom it's prepared of my Father. Now it's kind of interesting. Paul the Apostle, one was beheaded. He kind of curried favor being a Roman citizen. They couldn't crucify a Roman citizen, and so he had his head cut off. And that's one of the unfortunate things there. Peter said, I didn't feel myself worthy to be crucified in the same manner my Lord was, and so he said, I'm going to be crucified upside down. We read of others that were bludgeoned and speared and killed. There's only one of the 12 lived old age. His name was John. But they tried to boil him in oil, which wasn't a pleasant experience. It was not a sauna bath by no means. But they couldn't. He's so thick-skinned and callous, Morgan, they couldn't kill him off. So they banished him to the island of Patmos, and he stayed there and penned the book of Revelation. While he was there, later he became an elder at the church at Ephesus. He's buried there at the church of Ephesus in Turkey. His grave area is unmarked. All it says is grave area. It would be if you and I put a spot down there. We just said this is the famous Apostle John, writer of 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, Gospel of John, and Revelation of John. But all they have out there among the Turks is grave area, and that's where he's buried. Not only did we find the founders of our country were willing to die for freedom, and they pledged their life, their liberty, and the pursuit of everything. It's interesting that the 5 signers of the 56 men who signed the Declaration of Independence, the British captured them and marked them as traitors, and they were tortured before they died. 12 of the 56 had their homes ransacked and burned. 2 lost their sons serving in the Revolutionary Army. Another had 2 sons captured. 9 of the 56 fought and died from wounds or hardships of the Revolutionary War. It said they signed and pledged their lives and their fortunes and their sacred honor. And we talk about 24 who were lawyers and jurists, and 11 were merchants, and 9 were farmers and large plantation owners. Of course, some of these farmers were pig farmers, and the old British General Gates had to tell Washington that his troops were nothing but a bunch of pig farmers. But then that's when he told Gates, he says, I will let you leave Boston unscathed as long as you don't burn Boston to the ground. But he told his other under commanders, his colonels and his lieutenants, we'll follow them and escort them out. And then they turned right around, and the British were going to invade New York City next. But here's a bunch of pig farmers among other farmers. But these guys were men of means, they were well educated, but they signed this Declaration of Independence, knowing full well that the penalty would be death if they were captured. Carter Braxton of Virginia, a wealthy planter and trader, saw his ship swept from the seas by the British Navy. He sold his home and his properties to pay his debts, and he died in rags. Thomas McKern was also hounded by the British. He's forced to move his family almost constantly. He served in the Congress without pay, and his family was kept in hiding, and his possessions were taken from him, and poverty was his reward. Vandals or soldiers looted the properties of Dillery and Hall and Clymer and Walton and Gwinnett and Hayward and Rutledge and Middleton. At the Battle of Yorktown, Thomas Nelson noted that the British General Cornwallis had taken over the Nelson home for the headquarters, and he quietly urged General George Washington to open fire upon his home, which was destroyed, and Nelson died bankrupt. Francis Lewis had his home and properties destroyed. The enemy jailed his wife, and she died within a few months, and John Hart was driven from his wife's bedside as she was dying. The 13 children fled for their lives, and his fields and his grist mills were laid to waste, and for more than a year he lived in forests and caves and returned home to find his wife dead and his children gone. So we want to take a few moments of this 4th of July holiday, in between eating things off the grill and watermelon and listening to fireworks, and suddenly thank these patriots. It's not much to ask for the price they paid. We remember freedom is never free, and we hope we, this July 4th, support our folks in uniform as they protect America. Now, soldiers die for freedom too. I'm going to give you some insights that are history of the world according to Richard Geringswald. Nowhere in recorded history will anyone interpret what's happened in the last century with this interpretation. Many have other interpretations of what has transpired, but this is my personal view of what's happened in the last 100 years. And in this I declare that there are 4 world wars, and we're right now in World War IV. And I'm going to prove that to you as we move along. Now, scriptures teach us this, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free in John chapter 8. And it all started in 1914. And the big battle was between France and England wanting oil revenues in what then was the Turkish Emirates, and this was before Turkey even existed. It was the Arab Emirates before Afghanistan and Iran and Iraq were actually the countries they were. And it was Iran and Iraq oil that ended up becoming the war reparations that were given to France and to Britain at the end of World War I. And the Nazi, the German Kaiser at that time, not the Nazis yet, the German Kaiser at the time, the demands at the armistice were so, they wanted Germany to pay for all the expenses of over, I don't know, there were, what were there, probably 30 million, 40 million people that fought. There were probably 12 or 15 million casualties, or maybe more. Or maybe there's 65 million men who were mobilized, and more than 10 million were killed, and more than 20 million wounded. So of 65 million, you had 30 million casualties. That's pretty heavy. One of the guys that founded the Bible College in Jamaica, his name was Lieutenant C. Vincent Hall. He was at the Battle of Cambrai. He was part of they brought in the motor corps. Instead of having everything pulled by oxen cart and donkey cart, they decided to bring in the army trucks. And Pershing was the one that used this when he was fighting down in Mexico against Pancho Villa, and they found that they could fight war better with trucks bringing in supplies than mules and oxen carts bringing in supplies. And C. Vincent Hall happened to be a mechanic on the Liberty trucks that came on the scene and to wage war, and in the trenches of France he was there. Cambrai was the first time Mark IV tank came in, 110 tanks, and they pushed the Germans back about 7 miles, and the church bells of London rang because we pushed the enemy back 7 miles. 6 months later, the Germans were right back where they were to start with because they didn't follow it up. But in 2 weeks' time at the Cambrai offensive, there were 90,000 casualties, either dead or wounded. between the Germans losing 50,000 and the British and the Americans losing 40,000. Private C. Vincent Hall was gassed in those particular trench, but he went to his superior officer, and the superior officer says, "Where's your corporal?" "He's dead, sir." "Okay, where's your sergeant?" "Well, he got his legs blown off, sir." Where's your lieutenant?" "He's dead, sir." "Well, Lieutenant Hall, carry on." This is how people went from private to lieutenant in 2 weeks. It happened on the battlefield, especially with 90,000 casualties. You compare that to Vietnam, and you compare that to Korea, about as many people died in that 2 weeks as was in Korea and Vietnam put together, as far as American soldiers. 1914, 1918, World War I. This is the Mark IV tank and the famous machine gun emplacements. But then the Kaiser gives up and the war ends at 2 p.m. The hostilities cease and a truce is signed at 11 a.m. And then all the war reparations were dumped upon the German nation, and then the Germans had to pay the bill. Now, one thing we could talk about the Germans, they started 2 world wars, but us Germans, us Geringswalds, we were the ones that fought for the Caesars. It was the German bodyguard from Germania that actually became the backbone of Caesar's legions. It was us German Hessians that were the backbone of the British auxiliary forces in America during the Revolutionary War. And it was, of course, us Germans that had to whoop up on Britain and other European and France. And we started 2 world wars since that particular time. The Germans were well known to be the hunters of the boar. And being hunters, they were marksmen, and marksmen are automatically soldiers. And this was all part of that German economy. And they were mainly concerned being able to have the coal fields of Alsace-Lorraine. My grandma was from Alsace-Lorraine, and sometimes it belonged to France when Napoleon was in position, and sometimes it belonged to Germany when Hitler, the Kaiser, were in position. So that Alsace-Lorraine, which was the coal valley that was part of the steel industry, was all part of there. And Hitler had his entire Luftwaffe, Air Force, run by coal fuel. All the fuel that backed up his aviation was all from coal oil and coal fuel, aviation fuel, pulled from the coal fields. Now the next war we have is, there wouldn't have been a World War II if World War I had ended like it was supposed to be the Great War. It was always called the Great War, but then it ended up being the Second World War. And that was 1939 and 1945. I was born in 1947. They called us the baby boomers. It's kind of interesting that Mama had 4 boys. It seemed like Providence is allowing the mothers to have not daughters, but sons to replace all the sons that died in war. I don't know why that's the way it worked, but that's how it worked. But she lost one between me and my other brother, so she had 3 boys, 3 sons to grow up to replenish the male population in the United States of America after the war. Now, the First World War was against the Kaiser. The Second World War was against 3 isms or ideologies. You had Nazism, you had Fascism of Italy, and Shintoism, which was the worship of the emperor there in Japan. Emperor worship goes back to the Egyptians, where they worshiped the Pharaoh as God, and also the emperor, one of the first guys like Julius Caesar, wanted to be worshipped, and others like Caligula especially wanted to be worshipped as I am God. If you remember in the AD movie, Caligula wanted to put his statue in the temple of the Jews, and all of a sudden you end up with an all-out war between the Jews and the Romans, because they wanted to put him, a statue of him, into the temple place, temple area. These are the war, and the original plan too of the war was this: they're going to divide America. The West Coast was all going to be owned and controlled by Japan, and this was all the Japanese Pacific states, and then this is going to be the Greater Nazi Reich. So from New York to Florida and down the Mississippi. Actually, they're using, I used to think the Mississippi River was the divide, but actually the Rocky Mountain was the divide between Japan's possessions and the Nazis' possessions. And this is discussed in a book called The Man in the High Castle, which was written, and it says, what would the world have been like if the Japanese won and if the Germans had won? And if the Germans had gotten the atom bomb before the Americans got the atom bomb? What would have happened? Well, we'd be speaking German instead of English. Yes. Here was one of the great flag raisings in our battle against the in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese, and this is the famous picture of the raising the flag. But then, when we talk about after World War II, we have World War III. Some would call this the Cold War. Any of you folks fought in Vietnam? Any of you folks fought in Korea? Those are not Cold Wars. They're hot wars. Morgan brought with him some of the pictures of when the Americans from the 1948 through about 1952, we were always testing the borderline, and we'd send in spy planes. And Morgan was James Bond, Air Force espionage, and he has pictures of one of our planes in the MiG gun sights blown to smithereens. And we lost in that particular, it was about 15 men, Morgan? 17 men in that particular. And they finally brought the bodies back after so many decades to give them honorable burial. There are about 257 casualties during these testing the Russians' war preparedness and how far we could broach into Russian territory without ever by being able to get by with it. Francis Gary Powers, he was a member of the Church of Christ, non-instrumental. He was one that was in a U-2 plane, and in that U-2 plane he had cyanide capsules, and if he got shot down, he was supposed to take the cyanide capsules. Well, this Russian farmer was out in the field, and down comes this parachute in the colors he didn't recognize. And this guy that was built like a boxer came down. He thought he was a Bulgarian. He dressed him in Russian, and the guy responded in this strange language. And he said, I'll bring you to the airport. And they brought Francis Gary Powers to the airport, thinking that he needed to go back to the airport from whence he came. And finally, a KGB general came into the room, and the KGB general says, why did you not take your life? Because the rule of the thing is, if you get shut down, you take cyanide. You just took your life. You were spy versus spy. This is what they did back in those days. He said, I wanted to live. Later on, Francis Gary Powers, they did an exchange, I think during the time of Nixon, and they exchanged some Russian spies. They changed them for some of our American spies. And so it's one of these, we'll trade you 5 of ours for 3 years, or 5 for 5, and sometimes it's 5 for 50. But they did some horse trading to get these guys back. But World War III is an ideological battle again. Now, World War I, World War II were ideological battles. And I talked to one man, or saw an interview of one man that was, he was one that flew the last mission, and there was a 19-year-old serviceman that was killed in his plane as they were flying over Japan. And he said this young man that was in our group was he was the final death of World War II. But he says the whole reason we fought World War II was to fight evil. That was our purpose, to fight evil. They had purpose. World War III comes along. And this is the time that President Eisenhower decides to add "In God We Trust" on the back of the 1957 dollar bill currency. "In God We Trust" was not, the atheists say, well, this was later, it came in on the later thing, but we had "In God We Trust" on our coins right after the Civil War. In 1865, I think the Civil War ended. Was it 1861 to 65? And you have a lot of 3-cent pieces and 2-cent pieces that had "In God We Trust." I'm a coin collector. And those coins had "In God We Trust" on those particular coins. And it was part of America's repentance for the Civil War. It's to show that, God, we're sorry, heal our land. And that was all part of it. He wanted to, President Eisenhower, determine we want to show a distinction in ideology between America and Russia. Russia was a blatant atheist country. France was one we discussed as far as a blatant atheist country back during the French Revolution. They came up with an encyclopedia set that completely omitted mention of God in their encyclopedias. And then 3 years later, the Pope meets with Napoleon and says we need to reinstall the Catholic Church in France to bring some kind of semblance of religion back into this godforsaken French nation. And it happened. But the same thing with communist atheism. This was the ideology. And it was the ideology between good and evil. And it's not so much rich and poor, even though they want to make it rich and poor. It's the question is, can man live without God? And that was the battle. Now this was the Cold War. This was the Soviet Union at the time. Poland was part of it. Eastern Germany, Czechoslovakia. You had other nations, Yugoslavia and all. And a lot of these, Romania, Hungary, and Albania. And then this was into the Eastern Bloc. The Iron Curtain was right in here. And this is where in Germany they built the Berlin Wall. Now this was Korea. And in Korea there's the 38th parallel. And there's a building built on the 38th parallel in which the North Koreans and the South Koreans and the Allies and Axis powers discuss the way things ought to be or should be or had ought to be. And while these guys of North and South Korea were having a discussion, in the middle of this table, there's a line that just went right down the middle of the table. And on this side of the table is South Korea, and this side of the table is North Korea. That's the way it was all set up on the 30th parallel. One of the Americans that was there was writing with a pen, and the pen dropped and rolled under the table, and when he reached down to grab it, this big old army boot came crunching down on his hand. You just crossed the line and you are now in our territory. You invaded. Whenever his hand went under the table to pick up his pen, he got his knuckles crushed at that discussion meeting on the 38th parallel. And the Korean War, 60,000 casualties. Was this a Cold War? It was still a war. They said that Vietnam, as far as being part of these particular wars, was all part of this Cold War, where Peter Khrushchev would take his shoe and beat on the table of the UN building. And Kennedy was the one that actually avoided an atomic war between the Cuban Missile Crisis and Guantanamo and the Bay of Pigs invasion. But even that was one that was making America sweat. I think they said we're 7 minutes away from destroying the world. But you had the bear and Uncle Sam. And then the Vietnam War was a hot war, but this was one of the most controversial wars in which the beatniks and the hippies and all the other guys came out and said, make love, not war, and they started smoking their dope and started saying, well, all the politicians are sending your sons and your daughters to war, but they're not sending their own sons and daughters to war. And this was the discussion that came up, and then any time a soldier came back from Vietnam, the hippies and the beatniks said, no, you're a bunch of baby killers. And on that one. But this is the one that was based on, I guess, the MASH TV series where the evacuation helicopters pulled a lot of soldiers in and out of Vietnam. And we're talking about 50 to 60,000 American casualties at this particular war. Now we have the crush between the new Russian Federation and America. And they're strutting their weight, and they're saying Americans can no longer adopt Russian children. And I had a classmate of mine that adopted 2 Ukrainian children, and she had a house sitter that actually defied her. She had to fire her because she says, you were trying to teach, so a Russian, Ukrainian, at that time Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, trying to teach them American ways, and she deposed Dr. Nancy Welsh, my fellow classmate, for adopting these kids and trying to give them a better life. Now, we're talking about World War III ended whenever the President Reagan and the Catholic Pope, and I think it was Walesa, that was the Polish labor union leader, brought about the demise of the Soviet Union. And that's when Reagan says, Mr. Gorbachev, tear this wall down. And symbolically, that was the end of World War III, and the nation of the Soviet Union became the Soviet disunion, and it disintegrated. But it seems like whenever there's a vacuum, something's got to fill that vacuum. And so we had the rise of Islam, and we call this another ideological war between Islam, and others in America don't want to say it's a war between Islam and Christianity. But you talk to the Islam people, and they say it is a war between ideology, Islam, and Satan America, or Christianity. Like it or not, politically correct or not, we are fighting World War IV, and it's a religious crusade, even though they don't want to use the word crusade because you may offend people. It all started at the World Trade Center when these jets were flown into. There are 2,996 casualties that particular day. That's counting what happened in Pennsylvania when the one plane was forced down. This is counting those that died there at the Pentagon and those that died in the World Trade Center. Not all the people that died were American citizens. But we do know that among this 2,996 included the terrorists. They died too, and they're among that 2,996 number of those who died on that particular day. And this was the major beginning of World War IV. There were some other preliminary. Then we had the Desert Storm. And they said, well, this was a police action, or this was a scuffle. You had various countries of Britain and Canada and various Arab Emirates that came in. These were among the Arab groups coming in. This was basically your British. This is a lot of the American ground forces coming in to Kuwait to free Kuwait and drive out the Iraqi from that particular. And this was a coalition. You know how many nations were in that coalition, Morgan? How many nations were in that coalition? 37? I don't know. Check it up on Google search. But when you had 37 nations invading a country, they don't want to call out a world war? I'm sorry. And then these guys go in there and they only pick up fights with America and blow up our particular. They got to go into Russia. They got to go into France. They got to go into England. And they got to terrorize various groups. They go into our school of Ukraine. They kill our kids there in one of the Russian schools. You think that these guys got to be absolute idiots to take on the Russians? One thing we learned about the Russians, you don't kick that sleeping dog and not get bit. Right, Morgan? They bite. Those boys play hardball. Here's the coalition here with President Bush and the various flags that are represented. Here's Canadian and other flags represented from around the world. Part of this particular coalition, I think this is Pakistani, but this was showing the coalition that particular. Here's the Iraqi coalition forces. Again, you have Armored Division here in the infantry, the Marines. You've got the British, France, and Finland, Italy. I think that's Italy, Finland. But these are the various United Kingdom, some of those various national flags, Polish, Germany, and I don't know what this particular.
Spain?
España, okay, that's Spain. Okay, Spain. So this is showing some of the nations that joined in this international coalition against Iraq. Of course, they had to torch all the oil wells on the way out. It's interesting in this picture of the Desert Storm battle. Here's the chaplains digging a hole, putting some plastic down, pouring it full of water, and having a baptism in the middle of the desert. And this is one of the areas of faith in the middle of the desert. And this is a group prayer of the men there in Desert Storm praying for their lost comrades. We close out this morning with this thought: if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven, I'll forgive their sin and will heal their land. America needs to turn back to God, because the Bible says that at the name of Jesus every knee shall bow, and in heaven and earth and under the earth, and every tongue will confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of the Father. And this is what we want to leave, that King Jesus is still in control.
Amen.
We want to ask our musicians if they'd come at this time and give our closing invitation of song.